Hello and welcome to Phosphorus Live. This is our bi-weekly look at the very interesting world of XIoT, the Extended Internet of Things. I'm your host, Mike Huckaby. I'm the VP of Technical Go-to-Market here at Phosphorus, and I'm joined by our device-obsessed Senior Sales Engineer, James McCarthy. James, say hello.
Hello, everyone.
So we're happy to have you join us. We get together like this every 2 weeks to provide some education on the connected devices that we all use to run our businesses these days, and to give some insight into what Phosphorus does to help keep those devices secure. Format's really simple. We have a quick discussion on a specific topic, and then a Phosphorus technical take related to that topic. It's a quick hit, less than 30 minutes. We'll hold Q&A at the end. And today's topic is all about water. H2O, no, still or sparkling. But before we get kicked off on that, James, what's been happening the last couple of weeks around XIoT?
Yeah, absolutely. So in the world of XIoT, there's two, I think, really interesting stories that have been coming out that I've started looking into. One is there's a new chip manufacturer that came out with this really cool tiny modules, 11 millimeters by 11 millimeters, so really, really small. But what they did is they created this device that can then be used in conjunction with an IoT device to provide accuracy from a satellite down to the centimeter. So we're talking an accuracy for devices that's really even almost hard to measure at that point. So a really cool device. It's low power consumption. So what's cool is the implications for something like this are pretty infinite. So wearable devices, something you can go into your watch, something can go into clothing. And one of the use cases that they mentioned that I thought was interesting was what they called device-based agriculture. And so literally just this concept of being able to help farmers and help our agricultural infrastructure to more accurately measure crop growth and plant and food migrations, things like that, down to, like I said, literally the centimeter. So that's really cool. That kind of technology is even hard to imagine that it exists, but here we are.
Very cool.
And then the second thing I think that's really a little bit alarming for me actually is there was a report in a speech that was given just recently by Senator Wyden out of Oregon, where he sits on the subcommittee for essentially the federal energy agency that manages the dam infrastructure across the U.S. So we have 2,500 dams that are managed by this regulatory body. And the senator came out and was giving a talk specifically about the cybersecurity component to this. And there's a few things that he highlighted that were a little alarming to me, which is one that we have 2,500 of these locations across the country that provide power and water management across different cities, but there's only 4 human beings that are in charge of actually monitoring and auditing that infrastructure across the entire country. 2,500 dams, 4 humans, right? So
whoa,
insurmountable task for anyone to even accomplish. And so that's a huge problem. But the other problem that I think is really, really scary is that as a result of the lack of financial or economical support by the government to help secure this infrastructure, all of the dam operators are switching their hardware from a local only management model to a remote management model. And so now what you're introducing is remote connectivity into this infrastructure that's considered critical across the US, because we simply don't have the funding to actually support putting people or more manual labor at these locations to actually fix the issues, right? So a huge alarming issue for me. It was a problem that it seems like it should be an easy thing to solve, but obviously I'm not in politics. But the last piece here is that the FERC, the governing body over our critical infrastructure for dams, came out with their cybersecurity policies and guidelines to try and address this kind of shift to remote management. The problem is that those guidelines largely talk about, I mean, almost exclusively, how the dam operators should file their paperwork when something happens. There's nothing in there about the technical limitations requiring actual cybersecurity, maintenance around these devices. Nothing about how they should be connected to, how they should be remotely managed. It's really just a paperwork problem. So that's a little alarming that our infrastructure is running on this. It's a problem that we all know, but for a senator to come out just 2 months ago, who sits on that subcommittee, and confirm that was really interesting.
So all the guidance is if something happens, here's how to cover and that's
Yep,
it.
that's
Oh,
it.
that's crazy. Well, that's a
Yeah.
great lead in. That story is also a great lead in to our topic for today. So, hey, James, where do you land on still versus sparkling?
Still, the bubbles throw me off. If I want bubbles, I'm going to drink
Really?
soda. Yeah.
And I'm a big fan of SodaStream, so I've got that
Mm.
going all the time. So I'm on the sparkling side. So it's all about the water today and kind of the surprisingness of if the water supply and the water treatment supply all in the news. As we talk about protecting our water supply, I thought it was good to start with this question. What is critical infrastructure? Which water treatment plants all are considered critical infrastructure. So I got this definition from CISA. Critical infrastructure, those assets, systems, and networks that provide functions necessary for our way of life. They break it down into 16 critical sectors, water being one of them. And if any of those things that, because they're whole highly interconnected, if anything ends up happening, it could be debilitating to our country. And we're talking just the US, but it's really a global kind of issue. And we know when it comes down to it, the technology that ends up being put into critical infrastructure for a very specific purpose. The purpose is built for reliable operation of the functions of whatever that service is in that sector. And we all know that security is not the main focus at all. Most of the time, it's an afterthought. Hopefully, it's at least somebody thinks about it at some point. However, there is a large focus on preventing business disruptions, which has led to more of the focus on cybersecurity. Even though they don't start with it, business disruption is key. We know what cybersecurity attacks can do on the overall business, and so that needs to be controlled. So, I don't think I told you this, James, but I've been this last 2 months, there's been work down the hill from my house. And 3 times over the last month, water's been out for a whole day where I haven't had water at my house whole day. Now this is all planned disruption. So I could get in and I could fill up my sink full of water. But if we think about how it would happen in non-planned and how disrupted that would be if we didn't have a chance to plan for these coming, we know that the devices in these environments, inside of critical infrastructure, devices like these I have on my screen, especially we look at the PLCs that are there, that they're all highly tuned. They're all sensitive. And when something doesn't go right, we all feel the impact on this. And there's a lot that here we can learn. Now, inside of all of our environments in our communities, we all have water plants like this. We all have them around there. The whole, just making sure that we all get clean, good water to be able to use. So it's super important. And then if you looked at the devices that I saw that were kind of general in kind of critical infrastructure, in water, there's some very, very specific types of devices that are needed here, like filtration systems and flow monitors, pressure sensors, water quality monitors, and making sure that all of those things are making sure that water flow is not disrupted and that the water is good to use. It's kind of funny because one of the attacks that we saw was all about water quality, meaning that as an attacker got hold inside of one of these a water supply plant, they started inserting an incorrect level of chemicals inside of the water, which could cause a big disruption. Now, fortunately, somebody found it and discovered that it was happening. But those are the types of things that could be disrupted if any of these devices aren't taken care of. And as you probably know, it's been in the headlines like crazy over the last couple of months around the attacks on water supply. and water treatment plants all across the globe, and not only there, but also around the, not just in the US, around the globe. And we find that a lot of these are nation state attacks that are coming in that are trying to disrupt in a big way. You can see that there's kind of like a little bit game. How far can we actually go? And from one of the things that I've read is that the water sector is one of the least secure sectors of all of critical infrastructure. And that's why they're a prime target. And we can all learn from some of the issues that are here. And some of the attacks are pretty obvious. The attack vectors are pretty obvious. They're simple email phishing attacks, like the one that I just mentioned, where the insertion of other chemicals was an email, as a phishing attack against somebody, and then they were able to access the systems. But these things continue to happen and be pretty obvious. And one of the other attack vectors, which is maybe seems unlikely if I tell you, but it's true, is that there are PLCs, programmable logic controllers, that control a lot of the functions in these that are actually out on the internet facing. So if I one of the recent attacks on quite a bit of the call outs from the EPA and around the water structures based on this is one of the attacks that they call out. But as far as I can see, it was a PLC that was publicly available that had a vulnerability that an attacker was able to take advantage of, and then was able to log into the system using a default password. And then they put up this nice fancy "you've been hacked" screen on their HMI controllers to show that they've been hacked. It's nice of them to leave a calling card like that. This kind of disruption can happen all the time. And it really is a call for all of us to be paying attention. If you can't plug in an XIoT type of device and forget about it. You can't just put it on the internet and forget about it. It's going to lead to bad things happening. So because of this and because of the awareness, there's been a lot of information that's come out that have been calls to action and specific guidance. So there is a white paper that's out that was co-released by CISA, EPA, and the Department of Justice in the US around the top cyber actions for securing water systems. And there were 8 of the actions that were there. I pulled out 4 of them here, which are pretty obvious ones. Don't put your stuff on the public internet. Make sure that you're changing default passwords immediately as you put them in there, and don't leave a PLC with both. Make sure that you know what you have. I would think that a water supply treatment plant would be self-contained enough they would know what devices they have. Well, they can consistently point out that those organizations don't know everything that they have in their environment. And they need to reduce the risk of exposure to vulnerabilities by, one, understanding the vulnerabilities, but also making sure that all those devices are up to date and patched as the manufacturer is asking them to do. These are really key things. Now, I look at the list and I go, yeah, I absolutely believe these should be done for water. But you know what? This is good guidance for all of us, even if we aren't in critical infrastructure. But there's pretty decent guidance. A lot more government oversight in this. We all need to have the comfort that these organizations, all the water plants, are doing the right things. So as security professionals, and we're looking at things as we're helping in our communities as well, these are some of the things to be asking your water supply plants if they're doing the right things in cybersecurity to make sure that it's all taken care of. So now I want to transfer back over to James. James, I know you've got this is some crazy story here, but I know you've got some stuff to be able to show us.
Yeah, absolutely. So let me go ahead and share my screen here because I want to actually do a little show and tell with what I'm finding in my research. So we all like to think that large enterprises, big companies out there, have developed really mature cybersecurity program around, actually securing their infrastructures, even if it's in IoT, that they've got it all figured out. They don't, right? Unfortunately, that's just not the reality. And there's a couple ways we could actually prove that. And I think this is one of the ways I'd like to show here. So this is Showdown. something, if you're in the industry, if you're in the IoT space or cybersecurity, you're probably familiar with Shodan, but for anyone who isn't, Shodan is basically a big search engine for all of the IP connected devices and servers, desktops, whatever that are on the internet. So if it's public facing, Shodan goes out and tries to index that, right? So it's Google for IP addresses, essentially. But what Shodan allows us to do, and this is something that anyone can access, right? This isn't some special thing that only security researchers have access to, attackers have access to it as well, is this allows us to go in and search the world for specific ports and specific protocols. Now, we know that there are PLCs out there like Rockwell Automation, right, Allen Bradley's, that leverage very specific port and protocols. And so one of those ports is port 44818. Pretty common port. This is, again, something that PLCs leverage for management all the time. But if I just say, hey, go out and search the world for that port, right, for any devices that are active on that port, look at that number that we find. 564,000 devices that are currently connected to the internet that are PLCs on that port, right? That tells you the scope of the problem, right? That is significant. These are just devices that are connected to the internet. Now, what I did is I was going through some of the data and trying to find some interesting or compelling things to show, and I did happen to find one that I thought was a little alarming as well. Now, again, we think large enterprise, they probably have a very mature cybersecurity platform. They've done a lot to reduce their risk and their exposure to the internet. I'm sure it's basic hygiene stuff, but that's not the case. One of the first things I found that was compelling, PLC sitting on port 44818. Guess who owns this? Amazon. This is a device sitting at an Amazon data center somewhere in Sao Paulo, Brazil, that's sitting and publicly accessible to the internet. Massive, massive problem, right? And if I click this, it'll actually take us to the actual IP address on that port, so we can get in there and attempt to log in or attempt virtually anything else, right? And what's interesting is not only can we find this device on the internet and access it, but if we look here at Phosphorus, so this is our view of the same PLC. So this isn't the same one that's behind that IP address, but it's the same hardware, right? We can see here, this is a Rockwell PLC. We've got a lot of good information and detail around it. We can enumerate all of this by just connecting to the PLC. And so if we can do that, so can an attacker, right? So now the attacker can get into that PLC, pull all of this data from there, including what else might be plugged into that PLC. And what's interesting with that is that actually allows us to see beyond the single PLC. So now an attacker can see this device sitting in an Amazon data center somewhere in Brazil, and not only see what that device is, but they could start to enumerate what might be behind that device. And if we think about these PLCs, we can also see things like firmware. Right? What version of firmware is this thing running? Do we have any vulnerabilities associated with that, right? So we can actually see that there are, right now, active vulnerabilities with certain versions of firmware on that PLC. So it's entirely possible that PLC that we're finding at Amazon has a vulnerability that an attacker can leverage. And what's great is they don't have to get into the network. They don't have to do a social engineering attack. They don't have to do an email threat. They don't have to do something advanced where it's based on tricking somebody to get into the network. This is just sitting on the internet. They can just start throwing out the IP address of a bunch of vulnerabilities or exploits that leverage something until they get it right. There's only so many things that it could be, right? So just really, really kind of crazy thing that we can find so easily, something that's just sitting in an Amazon data center somewhere. But with Phosphorus, it's let's look at that and identify that first, and let's patch that and let's remediate that risk before it ever becomes something exposed to the internet, right? And so that's it. I wanted to show just some interesting things I found here. Shodan is a wonderful tool, very helpful on the white hat side of the hacking world, because it allows organizations and businesses to see what their external footprint looks like. It's a great tool for helping to reduce your risk exposure. If you can put in there your own public IP space and actually see what the world sees when they look at your IP space, and see if you have any of these obvious exposure points that could be easily leveraged by an attacker. So great tool, very powerful. Man, an AWS data center having a publicly exposed PLC, huge red flag.
Yeah. Indeed, and yeah, it's crazy what you could find out there when you use that tool. And the great thing that I like to point out about Phosphorus is that because we talk to devices, you know what their settings are, and then you can make intelligent decisions, great business decisions on what you should be doing. It all starts by having the right information at your fingertips so that you can make those good those
Exactly.
good decisions for your business. All
Exactly.
right. Well, I'm going to share again, James.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. All right. So that's our content for today. With Phosphorus being able to find, fix, and monitor and manage everything for you. If there are any questions that you guys have, please, you can drop it into a chat or you can raise your hand. If you're out on LinkedIn, I believe there's a chat facility there that our moderator can pull through as well. We'll wait here for a second and see if you have any questions for James Wright, either on the topic or if anything else around XIoT that you might be interested in knowing about.
Yeah, it's a great question that just came in on the chat. If we want to address that in real time here on the call.
Go for it.
Yeah, specifically about how Phosphorus can potentially integrate with something like Rockwell's factory access or asset center or other vendor specific platforms. And so for us, there are a number of integrations to these kind of vendor centric platforms that we explore, and some of them we do integrate with, some of them we don't. For us, the idea is, irrespective of the individual vendor platform itself, having a way to use a third party to kind of audit the things that you're doing with that vendor tool can be really powerful, because what we find a lot of the time is those tools don't have a discovery function, right? So the tool only has visibility into what you've manually enrolled into the tool. So that's your first kind of point of value that we can bring to that. The second thing is, when you create or take actions in these tools, a lot of the time in fact, most of the time, there's no feedback function, right? So the tool says, hey, I'm going to go and do a firmware upgrade, or I'm going to go change a setting or whatever. But there isn't, the tools don't often go in and validate that those settings took place, right? They just send a command and, it's kind of a black box from there. And so if you're doing that for one device, totally fine. You can just go in and manually check that device yourself. Not really an issue. When you start doing that for hundreds or thousands of devices globally, you start to have a real problem with just managing that process. And so Phosphorus can come in and say, all right, you've performed that action there, but can we actually validate that those things actually took effect and that the PLC is back online, right? So we don't generally have a strong desire or need to integrate with those types of tools, because we can kind of provide value alongside of them. We don't really ever replace the kind of the vendor native tool in that sense. But if there's certainly a use case that's compelling enough, especially in Rockwell, who we're very close with, we could certainly investigate that.
Thanks, James.
Yeah.
Any other questions that you might have for today? All right, I want to invite you all to take the Phosphorus 15, 30, 60 XIoT challenge. We put a link inside of the chat window, as well as you see the slide up. Take the challenge, head to our website, start finding and discovering XIoT devices in 15 minutes, in 30 minutes, be able to start hardening those devices, in 60 minutes, remediating issues on that. So hope to be able to hear all from you. Thanks for joining today. We'll see you again in 2 more weeks. We're going to show you a little bit of inside baseball from our Phosphorus lab in Nashville. So we look forward to seeing you then. Thank you very much, James. Thank you very much. We'll see you guys later.